The night rain lashed against the window, each droplet sliding down the glass like scratches on a gloomy painting. Elena stood motionless in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on her reflection under the dim light of the bedside lamp. The exhaustion etched deeply on her face was unmissable. The silk nightgown clung to her slender figure. Its elegance is unable to mask the loneliness that consumed her. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberately shattering the oppressor's silence in the room. Elena turned, heard her heartbeat quickening unnaturally. Theo, her husband's stepson, emerged from the shadows, his tall frame and rain-soaked dark hair giving him an almost spectral presence. His gaze bore into her, cold, enigmatic, but there was something about those eyes that held her captive. Elena. Theo's voice was low and hoarse, as if he had just walked out of a storm, but managed to maintain an unsettling calm. Down. I need to talk to you. Elena fought to maintain her composure through her throat felt parched. This late? Is something was wrong? Couldn't sleep, Theo said, his eyes sweeping over her before locking onto hers. Perhaps I've been thinking too much. The room seemed to shrink, its air thickening with unspoken intention. Elena instinctively retreated, but her retreat was stopped by the edge of the table pressing against her legs. About what? She asked, her voice carefully. Even though Theo didn't answer right away, the silence he created wasn't empty. It felt like an undercurrent dragging everything in its wake. He stared at her, his gaze piercing through the painstaking walls she had built around herself. Her hands trembled, and she quickly clenched them, trying to hide her uneasiness. Have you ever thought, Theo? Elena was frozen when he finally spoke, his voice slow and full of a quiet intensity that sometimes people can't control how they feel even when they know it's wrong. His words hit her like a blade, piercing the layers of denial she had so desperately clung to. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but his unwavering eyes held her down and demanded an answer. What are you? She whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Talking about? A bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the room for a brief moment, casting stark shadows on their faces in that fleeting light. Elena saw the truth she had been avoiding. No matter how much she denied it, the tension between them could no longer be ignored. And then Theo spoke, his voice steady and low but charged with a certainty that left no room for ambiguity. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Elena's time seemed to halt within the room. The only sound was the relentless patter of rain, like the quickened beat of her heart. Theo's gaze bore into her, as though peering into the depths of her soul, into feelings she had refused to acknowledge, but could no longer pretend didn't exist in that moment. The rain outside wasn't the only storm threatening to engulf them. Elena took a step back, her eyes locked on Theo's. The tension in the room was suffocating, as heavy as the air before a violent storm. She didn't respond to his words, nor did she try to deny them. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside, as if the rhythmic sound of rain could somehow bring her the peace she so desperately needed. But even the rain's soothing patter couldn't wash away the unease that had taken root deep within her. You shouldn't say those things to her. Voice was soft but firm, carrying an unspoken plea to end the conversation right there. Theo didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his tall frame casting a commanding shadow against the wall behind. I can't not say it, he replied, his voice gravely tinged with a pain that caught her off guard. Do you know what's been the hardest thing for me these past days, Elena? It's this feeling of being pulled into something I shouldn't feel. And the more I try to avoid it, the harder it becomes to stop. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. She knew she shouldn't ask, shouldn't dig deeper into the very thing they were both trying to ignore. But his words stirred memories she had buried, memories that now clawed their way to the surface. She remembered the first time she met him during dinner at Nathan's house. Theo had been a reserved young man, speaking only a few polite words to her, his tone clipped and his demeanor distant. His gaze, every time it landed on, she carried a silent suspicion, as though scrutinizing the woman his father had chosen when she moved into Nathan's home. The distance between her and Theo was greater than the towering walls surrounding the estate. He made no effort to hide his coldness, sometimes bordering on disdain. She could still recall the countless morns she tried to engage him in conversation over breakfast or offer help with his work, only to be met with blank stares and curt responses like no need. But things began to shift one bitterly cold winter night. She had found Theo is sitting alone on the porch, his eyes lost in the vast emptiness beyond a half-empty bottle of wine resting beside him. Worried, she had stepped outside with a thick coat in hand. You could catch a cold if you stay out here. Like this, she had said gently, her tone firm enough that he couldn't refuse. Theo had looked up at her then, and for the first time his gaze wasn't cold. Instead, she saw exhaustion, the kind of weariness no young man his age should bear. Couldn't sleep, he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's too much in my head. That was the first time they spoke for more than a fleeting moment. Theo had opened up, sharing stories about his mother, the woman he loved more than anyone in the world, who had left this life far too soon for him to truly comprehend what death meant. He spoke of growing up with his father, who, despite being physically present, often felt more like a ghost. Always there yet never truly there. Elena had listened quietly, not interrupting, not judging. For the first time she felt as though they truly understood one another. From that night onward their relationship began to change. The icy indifference melted, replaced by conversations that lingered longer than they should have. Sometimes they spoke of trivial things, small details about their day. But there was an unspoken understanding beneath it all. Still, there was one thing Elena could not ignore: the way Theo's eyes lingered on her, and the way it felt nothing like the gaze a stepson should have for his stepmother. You don't have to say anything. Theo's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. I know this is wrong, but you know as much as I do that we can't keep pretending. Elena turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. In that instant she felt every wall she had built crumble to dust. She couldn't deny it any longer. Deep down somewhere she didn't want to admit she felt it too, but letting these feelings going any further would only lead to disaster. No, Theo said, her voice trembling. We have to stop this before it's too late. But as she looked into his eyes, Elena realized that they had crossed that line long ago. The thunder roared, splitting the air like a blade through silence. Just as quickly the lights in the estate flickered out, plunging the entire house into darkness. And Elena froze mid-step, her pulse quickening as the sound of the torrential rain outside grew louder. Blending with the howling wind that rattled the windows of the house, felt alive with the storm, every creak and gust amplifying the weight of the night. Theo, Elena called out, her voice trembling as her eyes darted around the black void of the room. What's happening? No one answered. Her chest tightened as a cold draft brushed against her skin from the slightly open window, sending a chill through her, not only from the wind but also from the uneasy feeling that she wasn't alone. She strained her ears, hearing nothing but the constant pounding of the rain. Then a hand lightly touched her shoulder. Elena's body jerked in shock as she turned abruptly, almost screaming. But as her eyes acclimatized to the dim light from outside, she saw Theo standing just inches behind her. He had come so stealthily that she hadn't noticed until his hand touched her skin. Now, he was so close that she could feel his breath grazing her neck. It's just a power outage, Theo said in a deep voice, cutting through the oppressive silence, which was steady and almost soothing. But the warmth in his tone sent an uncontrollable chill down her spine. There's no need to worry. You startled me, Elena said, trying to steady her breathing. But her voice betrayed the quick pounding in her heart. Don't do that, Elena said, trying to steady her breathing. But her voice betrayed the rapid thrum of her heart. What are you frightened of? He stayed put, his presence felt in the small space between them. He asked, his tone carrying a curious weight. The dark or something else? His words hit her like a sharp note, forcing her to look away. She had no answer. At least not one she was ready to admit. What was she afraid of? Was it the storm raging outside or the storm raging within her? She couldn't bring herself to face him again, knowing that if she did, the thin thread of control she clung to might snap. You should check the circuit breaker, she said. Her voice strained and brittle as she turned toward the table, desperate to create distance from her trembling fingers, reached for her phone to find some light. There's no rush, Theo replied, his voice low and deliberate, carrying an undertone she couldn't quite decipher. This house has withstood worse storms. Elena didn't respond. She took a step toward the table, but in her distraction, her foot caught the edge of the rug. She gasped as she stumbled backward, the world tilting around her before she could hit the ground. She felt Theo's arms catch her, his hands firm yet careful as they steadied her for a few seconds. Neither of them moved. Her body was pressed against his hands resting at her waist. As he held her upright, the warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of her silk nightgown, sending waves of heat that mingled with the chill of the air made her heart pounded against her ribs. Every beat echoing in her ears as she became acutely aware of the closeness between. Be careful, Theo whispered, his breath brushing against her ear. You could hurt yourself. Elena wanted to push him away, to step back and re-establish the boundary they had both already blurred, but her body betrayed her, remaining frozen in place as she tilted her head up to meet his gaze. The room was dark, but even in the shadows his eyes seemed to burn with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Theo. She began, her voice breaking into the silence, but the words caught in her throat as he leaned in. Don't say anything, he murmured, his tone soft but resolute, almost pleading, just for a moment. No words, no rules. She didn't know what stopped her from resisting. Maybe it was the darkness enveloping them, making the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. Maybe it was the months of isolation and loneliness goring at her, or maybe it was the truth she hadn't wanted to face, that somewhere deep within she craved this moment just as much as he did when his lips brushed hers. It wasn't forceful or demanding, it was tentative, searching, as though he was giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. Her breath hitch as she gave in, letting herself fall into the kiss. The world around them faded, the rules, the guilt, the consequences. All that remained was the storm between them, consuming and inescapable. When the kiss ended, the room was still again, save for the sound of their labored breaths mingling in the quiet. Elena took a shaky step back, her fingertips brushing against her lips, which still tingled from the lingering warmth of this. We shouldn't. She started, but her voice faltered, her words hanging in the air, unfinished. Theo didn't reply. He simply stood there, his gaze heavy with emotions she couldn't name but felt deep in her chest. And in that moment, as the rain continued to hammer against the windows and the darkness wrapped around them, Elena knew that they had crossed a line. There was no going back. No erasing what had just happened. Even as she stepped away, her back pressing against the cold, while she realized that it wasn't just the power outage plunging her world into darkness. It was the choices she'd made, the feelings she'd allowed to take root, and now everything was about to change. The next morning, the mansion was bathed in brilliant sunlight, but its golden rays did nothing to lift the weight pressing on Elena's chest. She sat quietly at the dining table, her eyes fixed on the steaming cup of coffee in front of her. The heat rising from the mug seemed to blend with the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. The darkness of the previous night still clung to her, not only because of the storm but also because of what had happened. And the truth she could no longer deny. Theo entered the kitchen, the morning light spilling across his face. Elena didn't look up, but she felt his gaze settles on her, as though he were waiting for her to say something. The air between them was thick, suffocating, like a fog too dense to dissipate. He didn't speak, and neither did she. We both knew that phrase would only make things worse. You don't have to avoid me, Theo murmured at last, his tone so calm that it was unnerving. You think I can just pretend everything is fine? Theo? Elena's head sprang up, her eyes flaming with rage. You believe that this can be easily forgotten? He gave a brief, sour chuckle that was devoid of any sense of humor. No, I don't. But I believe you are as aware as I am that it did happen. And there's no turning back. Before Elena could react, the sound of a car approaching broke the tense silence, and she almost stopped when she heard the familiar hum of the engine. Nathan was home, and Elena bolted up from her chair. Her senses were racing. Nathan had not mentioned returning early, and now she felt completely unprepared to deal with him. The front door opened, and Nathan entered, his face beaming with the satisfaction of a successful trip. Elena, my love, he called out warmly, his voice carrying the cheer of someone unaware of the storm brewing within his home. But as his eyes shifted to Theo, his smile faltered, a flicker of something uneasy crossing his face, as though he sensed something wasn't right. Elena moved toward him, desperately trying to hide her rising dread. You're home earlier than expected, she said. Your voice was steadier than I felt. I wanted to surprise you, Nathan replied, his eyes still fixed on Theo. Elena felt the ground beneath her feet begin to give way before she could respond. Sarah, her best friend, came in behind Nathan, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she entered the room with a smile that stopped short of her eyes. Sarah knew something was evident in her eyes. Sarah answered, "Good morning, Elena." Her tone was light but laced with uneasiness, as though she were attempting to hide her discomfort. "I think we should talk about what Nathan asked." His eyes moved from Sarah to Elena, then to Theo, and his suspicion flickered in his face. The room seemed to get colder as Sarah hesitated for a few seconds, as if she was considering the consequences of telling the truth. But before she could say anything, Nathan's voice broke the silence. Low and commanding, "What's going on here?" Elena tried to speak, her lips parting, but no sound came out. Her breath quickened, her heart pounding so violently that it felt like it might burst from her chest. Theo then stepped forward, his voice slicing through the stifling air like a blade. "Do you want the truth, Dad?" His voice was forceful yet steady as he spoke. "I believe it's time for you to start taking notice of what has been going on in this household." Elena's voice was shrill and frantic. But it was too late, since Nathan's countenance clouded and his eyes locked onto his son like a hawk focusing on its prey. "What are you talking about? You've been blind for too long." Time seemed to stop. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Every second brought them closer to the inevitable, and Elena felt that everything was slipping away from her control. The secret had been pulled to the edge of the cliff, and now it only took one last shove to fall into the abyss. Nathan stared at Theo, whose eyes were as cold as an iceberg but blazed with a quiet rage. Elena stood frozen between the two men, the weight of her guilt tightening around her like a noose. She had no idea how to stop what was about to happen, but she was certain that the worst was only moments away. "Theo, what are you talking about?" Nathan's voice cut through the silence, deep and steady, but his eyes bored into his son with an intensity that demanded answers. Theo stood his ground unflinching. He met his father's gaze head-on with neither hesitation nor fear. "I'm talking about the things you don't see, the things you've chosen not to see. You don't know who your wife really is, and you have no idea what you've left behind every time you walk out that door for work." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She tried to step forward to stop him, from plead with him, but her body refused to move. She could only watch as Sarah, standing to the side, avoided everyone's gaze. Her nervous fidgeting betrayed her discomfort, but she didn't speak. Nathan's brow furrowed as he turned to Elena, his tone sharp and accusing. "Elena, what is he talking about? What this means?" "Nathan," Elena began, her voice barely audible, trembling under the weight of the moment. "Don't force her to say it." Theo interjected, his voice calm but firm, his eyes still locked on his father. "I'll to tell you the truth. There's something between her and me that you never noticed because you were never here to see it." Nathan's face darkened further as he swung back toward Elena, his voice now trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Elena, is this true? Is he?" When Elena told the truth, it felt like her entire world was falling apart. The tightness around her throat prevented her from speaking. The room was filled with agonizing silence that smothered everyone. Her inability to refute the accusation spoke louder than any confession ever could. "Could you really believe this is acceptable, Theo?" Nathan, his voice boomed through the room as he yelled. "You think you can destroy this family because of your selfish feelings?" Theo remained unfazed, but a short moment of raw vulnerability and pain flashed across his face before he responded with a bitter laugh. "You've never had a family, Dad. You were always too busy with your work to see anything that mattered. And now you want to blame." Nathan's glare hardened, his anger burning into Theo. Elena couldn't comprehend the weight of his stare. It wasn't just the sight of a guy who had been deceived. It was the look of someone who had lost everything. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice where any step she took would only drag all of them deeper into the abyss. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't think it would go this far. But I can't deny that something happened between Theo and me." The room fell into a deathly silence. Nathan stood motionless, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from his body. Theo said nothing, but after a long pause, He turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The heavy slam of the door echoed through the house, leaving an unbearable emptiness behind. Nathan looked at Elena one last time, his voice hoarse and heavy with sorrow. "I trusted you," he said, each word cutting like a knife. "But now I don't know what to believe anymore." Elena couldn't decide what hurt more, Nathan's devastated expression or the hollow ache left by Theo's absence. She stood alone in the middle of the room, feeling as though her entire world had collapsed beneath her feet. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter than it had ever been. Nathan didn't come home. Theo disappeared without leaving any trace of where he had gone, leaving Elena to live in silence and constantly wonder if there was anything that could ever be saved. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Elena sat on the porch, staring at the empty road in the distance. She didn't know what she was waiting for. A word of forgiveness from Nathan, a sign of life from Theo, or perhaps just a brief moment of peace for her weary. Eventually, she stood up, walked back into the house, and closed the door behind her. The world outside continued to ignore her suffering, but inside her, a crossroads had appeared, and she was unsure of which way to go. Her story, Nathan's story, and Theo's story all ended in uncertainty, leaving a secret that only time could reveal.